Captain Robert Bob Wolff was a combat aviator and prisoner of war in World War II. Following the surprise attacks on Pearl Harbor, Bob enlisted as a private in the United States Army Air Corps. In April of 1942, he was called to active duty and began his training as an aviation cadet. As an aviation cadet, Bob completed initial training in the PT-17, BT-13, and finally the AT-17. On January 4th, 1943, he was commissioned as a second lieutenant and assigned to fly the B-17 Flying Fortress. Following 3 months of training in the B-17, Bob and his crew, the Wolff Pack, were off to join the recently formed 100th Bomb Group, 418th Squadron in Norfolk, England. On September 16, 1943, the Wolff Pack embarked on their 8th combat mission and found their primary target near La Rochelle, France, obscured by clouds, forcing the group to turn to their secondary target. As they made their turn, they were attacked by fighters in flak. Wolff's B-17 was critically damaged, and after losing 3 of his 4 engines, he was forced to land in the water. They were picked up by a passing French fishing boat, but unfortunately, a German patrol boat was right behind them. Wolff was now a German prisoner of war. Lieutenant Wolff soon found himself assigned to Stalag Luft III POW camp. The guards on each corner armed with machine guns, double barbed wire fences, and the counting of prisoners twice a day made escape unlikely. On January 28, 1945, the Germans were forced to move the prisoners as the Russians approached. For 8 days, the prisoners marched through the snow, frigid weather, eventually ending up at a rail yard in Spremberg. Here they remained, enduring the tough conditions for 3 more months, until an Allied tank knocked down the gate and freed them on April 29, 1945. By this time, Lieutenant Wolff had spent 19 months in captivity. For his actions, Bob received the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Air Medal.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Bob Wolff, interviewed by Major Technologi.
All right, Bob, we're here. We made it.
I made it.
All right, like you've heard over and over, I can't emphasize enough how exciting it is for Class AY-15 to have you. So thanks for making the trip along with Barbara. I know it's a long way from California, so your presence here is outstanding. So thanks again. All right, I've had the pleasure of talking to you over the last 4 or 5 months. Got to sit down with you a few times and do my best to capture your story over the next 40 minutes or so. So here we go with our first question. A lot of us here remember on September 11th of 2001 what we were doing when the Twin Towers were struck. And similarly, you probably remember what you were doing when Pearl Harbor was attacked. So can you tell us about what you were doing when you heard the news?
About Pearl Harbor?
Yes, sir.
I think it was a Sunday morning, and I was sitting down with a sandwich, listening to the radio, and where the hell is Pearl Harbor? Well, so much for my education. And so I listened to the news on the radio, and of course we didn't have television in those days, but you stared at the radio speaker, and that's all we could do. My dad and mother were there, and my dad was in the Naval Reserve, and he was called up. And he was assigned to the Supply Corps and the Navy, and he supplied the Western Sea Frontier, which is what the Pacific Theater was called at the time. Anyway, he supplied them with the oil and other things, and he was in charge. He didn't actually take the oil out there. Anyway, I was a little bit shocked, and I wasn't sure what was going to happen. I'd already signed up for the draft, and they were drafting soldiers in those days. And I decided, well, I better get myself down to the office there and sign up. I went to the Navy office first, but because I hadn't completed college, they didn't want me. They needed a college education to learn how to fly, apparently. So I went over to the Army Air Corps. They grabbed me and signed me, and that was it. That was St. Patrick's Day, the day that they signed me up. And on April 29th of that year, they called me as a cadet, and I was sent to Santa Ana Army Air Base. And then I learned how to march, how to do KP, how to clean toilets, and so the usual thing that everybody enjoys when they first get in the service.
Outstanding. Now, you volunteered to join the service.
Oh, I volunteered, yeah. Listen, I didn't want to be drafted. My draft notice came about 6 weeks after I was already in the service, and so everybody was happy.
What did your family think about your decision to join the Air Corps?
Well, they didn't have much choice because I was over 18, and by golly, I was going to go to service. My dad was proud of me. My mother was proud of me. My brother, my younger brother, he thought I was doing okay. And so I went. And I will say this, that it was a change in my lifestyle, I can tell you that. Now,
so after the events unfolded at Pearl Harbor, you find yourself now enlisted in the Air Corps. What did you I know you didn't have much liberty outside of your military training you're talking about, but what did you see in society as the changes? What did you see happening around you as World War II was increasing in intensity?
Well, I didn't see a great deal from when I was in camp, but we did have limitations on shoes. There was limitations on gasoline and certain foods you could only buy with so many coupons. And but most people survived it very well. I didn't have any problem because my mother and dad had enough gas coupons so that I could drive around, and I had met my future wife, and while I was in the service and able to, I used to get home every weekend that I could, and we did fine.
Now, prior to entering your air training and you start flying, had you had any exposure to aircraft at that point, or what sparked you to fly?
I had been in an airplane once when I was about 10 or 12, and we got up in the air, and I looked down. How come we're going so slow? I have since learned about that, but no, I used to make model airplanes, and I flew them, and I had a great time. In those days, we didn't have little gasoline engines to power the airplanes, and so you had to wind up the rubber band that flew them, or if you had a glider, you carefully threw it and watch it plummet to the ground because I hadn't placed the wing properly. But no, I always wanted to fly, and I figured, by golly, that's what I'm going to do. I'd rather ride to work than walk to work.
Absolutely. So on that note, now you've entered flying training. Can you tell us a little bit about your flying training experience?
Well, I was thrilled to death to be learning how to fly, and the day I soloed, I could have walked on air, actually. And a few days after that, I took off on another solo flight, came in, and a wind gust hit me and dragged a wingtip, and boy, did I sweat bullets. I remember the name of that little Stearman. It was number 44, and the wingtips bent up instead of being straight. Anyway, I took another flight with an instructor, and he said, "Oh, you're okay." And so I went on from that. And then we went up to Minter Field near Bakersfield, and we flew the Vultee vibrator, is what we called the aircraft. And we had a good time in that. In fact, our instructor took me and another guy on a low-level flight over the city of Bakersfield one night, and there was all sorts of noise about it, but nobody said anything, and it wasn't until long after the war that I admitted, yeah, I was one of the guys. But then we went on to the Bamboo Bomber, which is what the Cessna AT-17 was called. There's no bamboo in it, but it was a wood frame, fabric colored low-wing aircraft, 2 engines, and it flew pretty good. We had a little excitement on that on one flight. We were paired up as cadets, and I was flying the co-pilot that day, and I happened to look out on the wing, and the cap had come off the gas tank, and gas was siphoning out. And with the engines and the gasoline and the fabric, we had to get down. So we put the switch on for the wheels to go down, and they didn't go down. So being the intrepid hero that I was, I had to get the crank and crank the wheels down, and then we had to buzz the tower to make sure that they told us that the wheels were in proper position, and we landed and there's nothing happened. A lot of noise, but no problem. So one other problem we had in the AT-7, this other fellow and I can't remember his name. Anyway, I was the pilot that day, or that night. We were flying sort of a navigation course. We flew from Roswell over to El Paso and back. And we got over El Paso, and I guess they thought we were the enemy because they started shooting at us, and flak was exploding, but they were very bad shots. That's why I'm here. And that was most of the excitement that occurred during flight training. We had, well, I remember once at Thunderbird Field where I took my primary, I had done something, and I don't remember what it was, but we had to walk the perimeter of the field with a chute on. And in those days, the backpack chute hit you right on the butt every time you were walking around. You didn't do it twice, believe me. Once of those tours was enough.
So you successfully complete flying training.
I completed flying training.
You discover you're going to fly the B-17. And what was going through your mind when they told you the news that you're going to fly the B-17?
Well, all the way through advanced flying school, everybody was talking about what they wanted to do, and my choice was going to be a P-38 or else the B-26. And so when the assignments came out, most of us ended up going to B-17 school, which I thought, oh my God, how am I going to fly a big thing like that? I got up to Boise, Idaho, and looked at one of those things up close, and I couldn't believe the size of that thing. Today it's a pretty small airplane, but you know, it's still my favorite aircraft.
So you see it now, and it's in your mind, how am I going to fly this big aircraft? And those of us who have had the honor of flying airplanes are eager to know, what did it feel like to fly that airplane? Did it react well when it was heavy? Was it scary to hit the end of the runway there?
I'll say this, the B-17 was a real pussycat to fly. It was very easy, and even I could do it. You know, the first time I got in there, I looked out there, and that wing seemed to go on forever. But it wasn't that big an aircraft. And actually, once you get used to it, it was a piece of cake. But the size of it at that time, to me, it was a monster. But it gradually got tamed down, and I gradually took over. And it was a pretty good aircraft. I enjoyed it.
Very good. Something different nowadays, for someone to become an aircraft commander, they go through usually years of training. They have hundreds, if not thousands, of flying hours before they assume that position of the left seat. That wasn't the case with you. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I was assigned as a co-pilot to another crew, and after about a month, they decided maybe I better take the lead and be my own captain, and I had my own crew. And so we trained for another month there at Boise, and then we moved up to Casper and trained there for about roughly 6 weeks, or I can't recall the number of times, the number of days. But we had 10 guys, and we all got along pretty well. And one member of the crew was Jim Brady. He was our top gunner. This guy was 35 years old, and he had to fight like mad to get in that position. He wanted to fly combat. So in civilian life, he'd been in the complaint department at Macy's department store, which made him quite capable of fighting the U.S. Army at the time. So he got to be top turret gunner. The rest of the crew were pretty good. Co-pilot Charles Stewart, he was about a month younger than I was. I was 21 at the time when I started flying the B-17, and our bombardier and navigator were a couple of other guys that really, they knew what they were doing. They were very good at it. And the gunners, I can't speak high enough about all of them. I think we had a pretty damn good crew. But anyway, going back to leaving Casper, Wyoming, we went to Kearney, Nebraska, picked up a brand new B-17, flew it down to Gulfport, Mississippi, which is not too far from here. Humid, yes. It's very, very humid, but we had a good time flying down there. 3 of us flew in formation over the whole state of Mississippi. I'd say we were between 50 and 100 feet over most of the state. One of the guys claimed he saw some moonshiners making white lightning. And I said, why didn't you tell me? We'd have picked up a batch, but he didn't tell me till after we'd passed it. And I don't know whether he actually saw it or thought he saw it. But anyway, that was a short haul. And we took a couple of fighter pilots out of Gulfport on a plane ride, and they couldn't stop counting the number of instruments on the panel there, because there's 4 of everything, and they only had 1 of everything when they flew their aircraft. But they were dutifully impressed, and so we let it go. And and then back to Kearney, and then we headed east to Bangor, Maine. And then from Bangor, we went up to Newfoundland and tanked up. Or where's Gander? I can't remember now. I think it was Gander Field or something like that. And tanked up again, and then we headed east. There's some moonlight, and we could see ice as we flew, and out this window and on this window was all black, but pretty soon the green of Ireland came up, and you never saw such a green thing in your life. It's a beautiful country. And we were heading for Glasgow, which was sort of a gathering place for the B-17s. They took our brand new plane away from us, put us on a train down to a station called Diss, that's D-I-S-S. It's about 20 miles south of Norfolk. And from there we piled into a big GI truck and drove to Thorpe Abbott's, which I had never heard of. And it was called Station 139, and that was my home for the next few weeks, or months, couple of months. I was taken as a co-pilot on a mission that was really rather peaceful. There were a couple of fighters showed up, and actually nobody got hurt. We dropped what we had to do. They dropped our bombs and came home, and I thought, gee whiz, this is a piece of cake. Well, on our second mission, we didn't have any problem, but we lost a couple of people, a couple of planes. Our third mission was the one to Regensburg, and that was a big-time mission. It was the anniversary of the first mission in Europe by the 8th Air Force. And we were to fly to Regensburg, drop our bombs on an Me-109 factory that was also building the mock-ups and the beginning of their jet aircraft too. We were the last in a line of, I think, 8 other groups. Our group, the 100th Bomb Group, lost 9 aircraft. We had a really stupid thing happened right after we crossed the border of Belgium and got over Europe. Either flak or machine gun fire hit the latch on the left life raft door, And that thing came out, slammed into the left horizontal stabilizer, put a huge dent in it, and we went down, probably 1,000 feet, and Stu and I kept horsing back on the stick, and we finally got back up in formation, but it scared the daylights out of all of us. And we were flying in formation, which probably isn't done much anymore, but we got back in position, and then all of a sudden we got a big bang, and apparently a 20 millimeter shell from some German fighter had blown a hole in the leading edge of the vertical stabilizer. There's a lot of pictures of that around, but the whole tail began vibrating like this, and the rudder pedals were doing this, much faster than I'm doing it here, but it's hard to keep your feet on the pedals. And so for the next 2 hours, until about 12:30 when we dropped our bombs, we were fighting this thing all the way. Then we dropped the bombs and then headed south, not west, back to England. We were going to Africa. There was the first shuttle raid that they made in the 8th Air Force, and at least one other plane that we know of had to drop into the Mediterranean because they were too badly damaged. Our damage was slowing the plane down, and I had to use more throttle to keep up. As we approached Switzerland, then Colonel Curtis LeMay circled the group around so that we could play catch-up. At the time, I was cussing him out. I'm not on the air, believe me. But I said, what the hell is he doing? Well, actually, he was doing us a favor because our group was so straggled because we'd lost so many people that we did have to sort of play catch-up. I reminded it to him, I think it was 1987, I met the colonel, or the general then, and I reminded him of it. I told him what I'd said, and he sort of smiled and said, well, it's okay, you made it. And I said, yes, sir. Anyway, we got across the Mediterranean and almost across, and all the red lights came on for the gas gauge. And our engineer, Jim Brady, he's the 35-year-old Macy's graduate. He kept transferring gas from one side of the plane to the other in order to make sure that all the engines were fed. And so we found an emergency field right on the shore of Tunisia at a little place called Bone. And we went in there. It was a British airfield. There was nothing but mats laid on the sand. And we turned around and came back in to land there. And the guy said, there's a smash up on the ground here. Would you please go around? And I said, no, I can't please go around. The plane's not responding. And so we landed, and two planes had bashed wingtips or something on landing. We managed to dodge them and started to taxi off to one side, and all the engines began quitting one after the other. And so we got far enough off the runway, and the plane just absolutely stopped because at an angle like this, the gas tanks weren't feeding the engines anymore. There wasn't any gas to do it. So we spent the night under the ground, or under the wings there on the ground, and the next day we got picked up and taken off to Marrakesh, which is on the west coast of North Africa. And we had a few days there, and then we got shipped back on some general's plane and got to take up flying again.
Yes, sir.
And September 15th, we got back from leave on London. This prior mission was August 17th. On September 16th, we took off on our plane. We had to wait for a couple of hours while they patched up the plane because it had been out the day before and there were a lot of holes in it. Not too much damage to the people inside, but they wanted to patch all the holes. So we were about 2 hours late taking off. And we knew where the route was, so we followed the group, which was an hour, 2 hours ahead of us. We caught up with them off the coast of Wales, and we had to go around. We were so low, the whole group was low because they didn't want the German radar to pick them up. The group went around this side of a mountain, and we were catching up, and we went around this side, and we finally picked up the group, and we were assigned the tail end Charlie position. It's called SN Charlie at that time, a coffin corner, whatever. And it proved to be exactly what it was, because we approached the target, which was the airfield down at Bordeaux, and it was overcast. And so we turned to a secondary target, which was the submarine pens at La Rochelle. And about that time, number 3 engine began running away. Apparently something had hit it. I never saw the fighter that did it, but so on 3 engines, we dropped back maybe half to a quarter of a mile behind the group, so I pushed the throttles forward to catch up. And we were almost catching up when number 2 engine got it. That's the left inboard. And I thought, oh, 4-letter word. And so I knew we couldn't keep up, we couldn't stay at altitude, so I pointed the nose down about 45 degrees, pushed the other 2 throttles all the way forward, and I know our airspeed was redlined at 320, and I looked down once and the gauge was reading 320. And anyway, we got down on the ground. Tell me if I'm going off.
No, you're answering all the questions. I don't. They don't want to hear me.
Listen, I've flown this last flight 10,000 times up here. Believe me. And anyway, we got down about halfway down. Buzz White, our bombardier, says, "What are we going to do with these bombs?" I said, "Get rid of them," because I didn't know what the heck was going on. If we had to get ditch or anything else, I figured, no, we've got 2 engines, we'll make it. Well, we got down 50 to 100 feet off the ground, and gee whiz, there's this church steeple coming up, and it was about that high, way above our head. So I turned to avoid it and got straightened out. And then here comes this big bridge. There's a big bridge in Rochelle. It's a big transporter bridge. And it's about maybe 200 feet high, and we were at 100 feet, so I think I had to get away from that. So we avoided that one, got out over the water, got out about maybe 2 miles, and the right outboard engine blew 3 cylinder heads, and we were on fire. Tail gunner says, "Hey, what's going on up there? There's fire back here." I said, "Yeah, we're going to ditch." And so we did just that. The plane, the B-17 won't fly on 1 engine. It'll gradually lose altitude. And so we did. We lost altitude. We dragged the tail a little bit, slowed down. The rest of the plane slammed down, and we made it. And everybody else had accumulated in the radio room, which is standard procedure for ditching in that plane. And so as soon as we stopped, they all got out, and I sat there turning off switches, you know, make sure. I don't know, but it was one of those things you to do. And I noticed the plane was not going to stay in that position, and I debated trying to get back there to the radio room and climb out. No, I stood the window open on the pilot side. I had a tin hat and all on. I dove out that window, didn't touch the sides, and the window was only about this big. Anyway, I landed in the water and climbed up on the wing, which was still there. And the other guys in the dinghies came up, picked me up. And here's this French fishing boat coming. And I thought, oh boy, we've got it made. And so I looked around, and there's this German patrol boat. It's about a 30-foot boat, mounted machine gun on the bow, and the guy standing there. And I thought, oh, four-letter word again. And so they watched while the fishing boat picked us up, and I had a 45 in my pocket down here on my flight suit, and I didn't want to be caught with that, so I gave it to one of the crewmen on the fishing boat. I don't know whatever happened to it, but then we spent the night in a, well, I called it an old castle at the time because I didn't know what the heck it was, but it was a stone fortress or stone prison. And I think it was on a little island out there off of Fords is the name of the city. Ile d'Aix is the name of the island. And I was put in this cell. It was about 8 feet long, had a concrete bed about this wide with straw on it. There was a pit at one end of the cell, I guess for relief, when I used it. Hey, listen, after 10 hours or 8 hours, you know, you gotta go. Anyway, they fed us a tin plate full of something, I don't know what it was. All I called it was a thin gruel, sort of a soup. And the next morning they put us on a boat and took us over to a hospital school near Rochelle. It was on an air base, and they said that when we went over their air base, and I didn't know we had gone over it, he said they were at an early dinner, and they all dove under the tables. So I apologize for disturbing their meal. Not really, but anyway, we stayed there for a couple of days till they decided what to do with us. And they put us on a bus and took us up to Paris. And second time I'd seen the Eiffel Tower. The first time was on a prior mission. I saw the Eiffel Tower. It was about that big. Didn't seem that big at the time, but it was. Anyway, I saw the Eiffel Tower again, and they put us on a freight train in a boxcar, and took us to Frankfurt on Main, which was an interrogation center. And there were other prisoners that they had too, Brits and so forth. And I learned a lot of dirty songs there, which I'm not going to sing to you, but I'll tell you, it wasn't an enjoyable trip, but learning something like that sort of took the fear out of you. Anyway, we got to Frankfurt, and first thing the guy says to me when I walked in, he says, "Well, congratulations." I said, "What?" He said, "You're first lieutenant." Well, I'd gotten the bars a couple of days before I went down. And he had me down on a 5x7 card as the second lieutenant, and I'd gone to this flight school, and I'd gone to high school and so forth, and I lived at such and such a house. I'll tell you, they had more information on me than I thought existed. And he said,